Hello, role-playing people, and in this episode we're finally going to have a look at Dur-An-Ki, probably the oldest form of officially recognized blood sorcery since the time of the Second City, which is practiced by the Assamites or the Banu Hakim. Before we begin, I must confess I struggled quite a lot to truly understand this practice, to understand exactly why it works and how it differs from the sorcery of the Tremere, or the ways of the Koldun, or the Setites' worship of their dark god. Though my instincts were pointing in the right direction, I simply didn't have the necessary means to explain that intuition. Even after multiple, repeated reads of the Blood Magic Secrets of Thaumaturgy book, which is a good book for the most part, my understanding of Dur-An-Ki boiled down to something bloodweed Mesopotamian magic because reasons, paths named after deities the Assamites don't worship but seek to become, more something something, Mithras because why not, fusion of traditions, something else, Caliph, astrology tapping into television broadcasts. Yeah. For all the deep explanations this book offers in regards to the other sorceries, it is frightening just how little it actually explains of Dur-An-Ki and how poorly it connects the manifestations of the sorcery to the actual sources of this magical practice. So I looked through my go-to Dark Ages books, the guides to the High and Low clans and the Libellus Sanguinis series, but I found no answer. I looked to Mage the Ascension and managed to justify a few things which made sense, hypothetically, but I gained no real certainty or deeper understanding of this practice. Another Modern Knights book I had hoped would share at least a modicum of wisdom was the Revised Clan book, but the only thing it left me with is that an Assamite sorcerer need not cast his magic the same way twice, and that this practice is fundamentally different from thaumaturgy. That's about it. So I started reading the real-life lore of Marduk and Mithras, since these seem to be prominent figures in Assamite magical practices. Luckily, I already had a little something on my shelves at home, and on this occasion I revisited the Corpus Hermeticum as well, trying to find a connection. What do these deities, Marduk and Mithras, have to do with undead diabolarists par excellence? I just wasn't seeing the connection, and I gave up for a few months until I remembered that a mere 2 years after the release of Blood Magic, a book which only deepened my confusion, the book Blood Sacrifice, the Thaumaturgy Companion, was also released in 2002, a book I frequently overlook and forget about. And wouldn't you know it, this was the one I needed to finally understand how and why Dur-An-Ki works. Let me just say, I don't think players should seriously brush up on 5 different mythologies and religious systems just to really understand the core principles of a fictional blood sorcery. So I really hope this investigation explains it as clearly and in as much detail as I could fit into the episode. The questions I will attempt to answer are the following. What is the central, most important element of this practice? Why does this element encompass so many adjacent practices and divine figures from multiple cultures? What does the book mean when it says these sorcerers don't worship their deities but seek to become them? How can they cast their magic without appealing to formulas or rotes? And my favorite, what does smoking bloodweed have to do with becoming a god? Alright, let's ascend this celestial staircase together. The first thing we need to mention is that the sorcerer caste was founded in the time of the Second City, so after the Great Deluge, and it was founded during the Bali Wars precisely to counter the very powerful magic of those devils. There is exactly one source which places the first Bali War in the time of the First City, and that is the Dark Ages Companion from 1997, but that information has been revised by all subsequent publications, which say the First Bali War began during the time of the Second City. And that makes sense because during Enoch, embraces weren't a frequent occurrence yet. This was predominantly the home of Cain, his progeny, and his progeny's progeny. The clans we know today with their various branches and bloodlines didn't exist yet, and it's highly unlikely that the sorcerers, as a new separate branch of the Banu Hakim, appeared so early. It makes much more sense based on the history and internal logic of Vampire the Masquerade chronology that they appeared during the Second City. Not to mention, for players who enjoy the idea that Saulot is the progenitor of the clan of devils, he creates the Bali only after his first journey to the east, which, according to multiple sources, happened after the Great Deluge, so during the time of the Second City. That being said, I take you back to those unimaginably ancient, mythical times when gods all but walked among men, as knowledge and worship of such entities was considerably more prominent than it is today. It was a time of gods and covenants, and like any self-respecting deity, Cain also had some commandments for his childer. The Book of Nod supposedly contains the word of Cain as lawgiver, because he effectively makes a covenant with his progeny in that first city, similar to the one between the biblical God and Adam and Eve. A little later, Hakim, the judge, the law keeper, also makes a covenant with his own progeny, and we will briefly go over his commandments since this episode is about the Assamite clan. Honor the eldest among you, for he is to rule my house when I am absent. Ward the mortals from Cain's descendants and treat them with honor in all things. Slay not those of the blood, for that judgment is for the eldest alone. Deceive not those of the blood, for my house is founded on truth. Judge those of Cain's blood and punish them should they be found wanting. These are the precepts all children of Hakim followed, just like the mortals before them followed the laws of their gods, and in following those laws, they behaved in a manner that was to their gods' liking. To perform your duty as a hunter, judge, and lawgiver is to be Hakim-like, and to Hakim's liking. The Bali also behaved in accordance with the Dark Masters they served and emulated, receiving infernal gifts from those entities, sorceries with which to spread hell on earth, for you see, during those times this was the only magic available to vampires. It would be millennia until Tremere and his brood discovered those hidden little rotes which have power in of themselves. But during the Bali Wars, any sorcerer gained power from a patron, a demon, a spirit, or a deity, power that was given to the sorcerer priest precisely to further the agenda of said deity, to act as its avatar. And I'm using the term sorcerer priest intentionally in reference to Aku. Does the Setites' magic performed by lector priests not come from reaffirming their complete adoration of Set, taking him as an example to follow and performing the instructions or rituals he himself left for them, thus honoring their covenant with him? Did the Bali not honor their own covenants with their unclean masters by acting as agents of hell? Despite the undisputable existence of covenants during those ancient times, the Cainites' understanding of sorcery was not very good, even during the Bali Wars. According to the Assamite clan book, Hakim founded the sorcerer caste, his magi, by embracing mortal mages, 3 of them initially, but even so, their attempts at basically reducing dynamic magic to blood sorcery had been quite inefficient. And things were not looking good at all, since the Bali were gaining ground in this conflict. Saulot had always claimed that his warriors would be able to withstand the magics of the devils, but this was not so. And actually, both Hakim's judges and his sorcerers were almost wiped out by the Bali after operating under false information and being ambushed. The only reason this tragedy was averted was because of the arrival of Ur-Shulgi. Though the White Wolf Wiki claims he is the second child of Hakim, I have found no sources for this. Quite the contrary, I've found clear indication that he is just one of many children of Hakim. However, Ur-Shulgi is extremely important to the clan's history because he was the first truly accomplished Assamite sorcerer despite being recently embraced. The prodigy who showed everyone just how potent this blood magic can be. He single-handedly turned the tide of the Bali War by destroying so many of the devils in that cavern during their own ambush that over the next century they were pushed out of the city, and over the century following that, pushed back all the way into the mouth of whatever hell they crawled out of. Really, without Ur-Shulgi, the Assamites probably wouldn't have existed for very long. Despite their victory and the official recognition of the sorcerer caste by the other clans, Hakim grows disenchanted with the second city, so he leads his entire clan into a little exodus and they settle in Alamut. Okay, enough history. How does Dur-An-Ki work, and why didn't it work for those initial 3 mages Hakim embraced? Well, it didn't work for them because they approached undead magic in the same way the Tremere would, millennia later. The difference is that the Tremere had plenty of time to conduct their experiments, to slowly uncover the secret formulas with which you can bend reality to your will, not to mention they might have had some aid from a particular spirit of the land, Kupala. On the other hand, Hakim's magi were being attacked by the Bali, besieged, as they were still figuring out the principles of their magic, so that they didn't have the time to experiment and uncover precise formulas. But Dur-An-Ki is not that anyway. The central pillar of this practice is the covenant, a bond between practitioner and deity. These bonds weren't new to the awakened, to the mages of those times, and they certainly weren't new to the mortal tribes who made covenants with a plethora of deities after discovering such entities through various prophets, shamans, exorcists, and so on. What Ur-Shulgi does is simply to carry that covenant into unlife, to maintain his connection or re-establish a connection to a greater deity, even after the embrace, which, according to vampire and mage lore, destroys your avatar, your higher self. Thus, the Assamite sorcerers are theurges who form a bond with a powerful deity, spirit, whatever you want to call it, and gain power from that deity as long as they honor the covenant. This is not the same as Koldunism, in which the bond with spirits is a trading of favors, short and transactional. Dur-An-Ki is a long-lasting contract, a prolonged symbiosis, for lack of a better term, in which the patron offers its power or aid, and in exchange, the theurge performs acts that are to the patron's liking, rituals, or whatever these acts might be. The gods themselves aren't necessarily moral beings, as we can see in a lot of different myths, so moral purity isn't a requirement of this practice because the ancient gods, as transcendent creators and rulers of the world, are beings of immense power, first and foremost. Simply acting according to the deity's liking and embodying its aspects, becoming its avatar, seems to be the way to go, which is why the books frequently mention that these magi don't worship their gods, but seek to become them. Certainly, Dur-An-Ki, just like Ur-Shulgi and the Bali Wars, predate even the oldest real-life known sources for Mesopotamia, but it seems that Mesopotamian culture infiltrated and influenced Assamite sorcery to the highest degree, probably solidifying the pre-existing principles and practices into something much more coherent. That being said, Assamite sorcerers are referred to as Ashipu, which were Mesopotamian ritual specialists and exorcists who banished evil spirits and maladies through the power of their gods, making use of spells, incantations, and ritual objects, such as amulets. Without going into too much detail, in Mesopotamian belief, the gods are the creators and rulers of the world, who made humans as their servants. These transcendent beings do not reside in the hearts of men or in worldly objects or places, though they can inhabit a statue or temporarily reside within a place. They are above the heavens themselves, and they control things such as the waters, the air, storms, the sun. They have power over love, fertility, war, the underworld. Their knowledge is unimaginably vast, and they teach their preferred servants crafts, astrology as a means of divination, and many, many other useful things. Because there is a hierarchy among these entities, the greatest of them can grant power over not only the visible elements of creation, but also the unseen, lesser spirits, which is why Assamite sorcerers can definitely practice something akin to the path of spirit manipulation, something that, upon cursory observation, might even look like Koldunism. Now, something I want to address really quickly: does the existence of Dur-An-Ki as a practice confirm without a doubt the existence of these great deities in Vampire the Masquerade? Not really, and I say not really because of two reasons. The first is the idea of consensus from Mage. The collective beliefs of humanity effectively shape reality as we know it. Reality is perfectly fluid in the world of darkness. So this is the first idea. The second, again according to Mage, is the High Umbra, a distinct space in the spirit realms, which is very similar to the Platonic realm of forms and ideas, a place where the powerful thoughts of humanity exist and take shape as astral entities or egregores, if we can call them that. An egregore is a non-physical entity which awakens or arises from the collective thoughts of a distinct group of people, kind of like a living, powerful archetype or a concept or a deity. In the world of darkness, if enough people believe it, it exists, at least on some level of creation. So there we go. Whether they predate and created humanity or were themselves created by it, powerful unseen forces akin to deities exist in the world of darkness in one form or another. But vampires are spiritually devoid leeches and parasites. Even those who once knew what it means to be awakened lost their avatars upon the embrace and the ability to practice dynamic magic. How can they ever hope to ascend spiritually? And this is where the terms used in the book Blood Magic: Secrets of Thaumaturgy completely threw me off track. The book says the Assamite rituals are a mockery of the real things, but that doesn't mean they actually intentionally mock the religious rites of mortals in a genuinely blasphemous way. Rather, it simply means that they borrow from those rituals and use bastardized versions of them, tailored to the undead practitioner. Now that we've reached this point, we can answer another one of my questions. How is it that Dur-An-Ki mentions all these different deities from Marduk and Tiamat, from Enki and Ereshkigal to Mithra, the Jinn and even Allah, or the Egyptian Hel, Duat, or the planets, which are of course named after Roman deities like Jupiter, Mars, or Saturnus. It's quite simple, actually. Assamite sorcerers aren't limited to making a single covenant with a single deity, though of course it is desirable to make a bond with the most powerful of spirits. As long as the interests of their godly patrons don't collide, and the Ashipu can serve both, there is no good reason why they can't have multiple covenants at the same time. It's obvious you can't grow a bond with both God and the devil, for obvious reasons, but making a covenant with Neptune might not bother Enki too much. As a matter of fact, the Ashipu might not have a covenant with the entire deity in all of its aspects, but might require aid from a single aspect of said deity. That might sound strange, but in quite a few mythologies and belief systems, there is this idea that a deity is a multifaceted entity, very complex, and humanity observes only certain aspects or epithets which describe mere shards of the whole. Hecate, for example, has numerous epithets such as apotropea, evil averting, or frimo, furious, terrible one. You're not going to ask evil things of the evil averting one, just like you're not going to ask for wealth and fortune from the furious, terrible one, right? You invoke the aspect which is most likely to aid you. So the most difficult aspect of Dur-An-Ki by far is for the undead practitioner to figure out exactly what their deity wants, how they can make the covenant, how to maintain it, and how to deepen that bond and ascend the divine ladder. Ascension is something the gods can offer, especially since a majority of myths illustrate the rise of lesser deities to a greater rank or station. Marduk is like the fourth or fifth generation from the divine pair, Habsu Tiamat. I will have to look that up. But he becomes king of the gods at a later time. And the same goes for Zeus. He is a child of Kronos, child of Uranus, and he also rises to the top of the divine hierarchy. My point is, this is what Assamites refer to when they speak of climbing the ladder of heaven, or becoming the master of heaven and earth. And this is also why they don't grovel or beg before their patron deities in frightened worship. Instead, they emulate these patron spirits and seek to become like them, to become godlike. Once a covenant is successfully formed, the Ashipu have access to their path powers, and they call upon the covenant by making an offering of vitae and calling their patron to act through their will. And this is where a lot of the paths of Dur-An-Ki are very similar to thaumaturgy in mechanical terms. You spend one blood point and roll willpower, because again, as a supposed avatar of a deity, you don't beg for help. You ask for what's rightfully yours according to the agreement. In furthering the understanding and connection with the great spirits, the Ashipu must seek out knowledge from tablets, scrolls, or books, from prophets and priests, from any sources they can find, and finally, in the absence of other sources, from altered states of consciousness. But before we get to the bloodweed, we must talk about how the sorcerers manifest their covenants. They make use of a wide array of talismans, amulets, and relics, such as cylinder seals, the plaques, tablets, and scriptures I've already mentioned, figurines and statuettes, which, according to Mesopotamian belief, could be inhabited by the gods, and as such they were kept clean, offered food and drink, animal sacrifices, and had rituals performed before them. Then there's zodiac signs and various astrological symbols, rosary prayer beads, incantation bowls, necklaces, rings, and we can imagine, especially for the more rebellious and modern sorcerer, tattoos. Certain tattoos can be very much considered signs of allegiance, and bearing a permanent mark of your deity is a powerful affirmation of the bond between you. All of these means and more can be used depending on the mortal tradition being emulated and depending on what the patron wants, of course. When it comes to the rituals the Assamite magi perform and the deepening of the mystical bond between Ashipu and their patron deity, simply performing the same tasks over and over again doesn't necessarily lead to growth. Mere repetition is not enough, because the more you can give your deity and contribute to its glory, the more you will receive. But the texts and mortal prophets only offer so much knowledge, so how do you uncover more? It is at this point the Ashipu finds means of stepping outside themselves, expanding their consciousness and trying to commune with their patron through what are effectively visionary journeys. These are frequently achieved through various ecstatic techniques, which also enable the sorcerer to perform their rituals in most circumstances. The ecstatic trance can be entered through prolonged dance, pain, meditation, eloquence and art, whatever other exhausting activity resonates with the patron and pulls the practitioner outside of themselves, but most commonly through drugs such as Khalif. Contrary to popular misconception, not all Assamites are weed-smoking assassins. The actual assassins of the clan, the warrior caste, stays as sharp and alert as can be. It is only the sorcerers who indulge in such ecstatic practices. Now, some sources say Khalif induces blissful hallucinations in uninitiated users, while others say it is only sorcerers who can feel the effect of Khalif, or at least they are the only ones who can use it to shape the high and the hallucinations into a visionary quest, which supposedly carries the initiate through the spirit worlds. What's clear is not every Assamite can just become a sorcerer, and these practices are reserved for only a select few. On the topic of rituals, the rituals themselves, as presented in the Thaumaturgy Companion, are based on the knowledge of mythology, the ritual reenactment of key scenes from the lore of a deity or another, and the various religious rites that were performed or are still performed by mortal worshippers. As mentioned before, the Assamite magi effectively hijacked the practices of mortals. Most of the Ashipu's rituals involve the spilling of blood, which is normally the vampire's own vitae, but it can also be Assamite blood. The Assamite rites that are influenced by Mithraism, for instance, can be performed by spilling the blood of bulls, and this is just one example. This sorcery can borrow from a ton of different religious or ritual practices, so it's very, very versatile. For the most part, the magic is imitative, it's artistic, if we can use this term, and again requires an altered mental and emotional state as a core condition. But the sorcerer need not always enter the ecstatic trance in the same way. As long as the trance itself is produced and the core elements of the ritual are present, it works. It just works. And this is why Dur-An-Ki rituals are so different from the rituals of the Tremere, which require absolute precision. The Ashipu, on the other hand, they can use any tools at their disposal to get into that trance. The limit to the character's ability to draw upon the Covenant and any adjacent practices is related to their physical endurance, their stamina, to be more precise. And no sorcerer can have a path rating and, by implication, a ritual rating higher than their stamina. This is because the undead physicality itself needs to adapt to better embody the archetype or deity, to be able to offer more in order to receive more, to endure more pain, exhaustion, starvation, and, well, in the case of Khalif smokers, a higher quantity of drugs, as funny as that might sound. Having said all of this, the last thing I want to do before concluding is to explain why the clan flaw of the sorcerer caste makes a lot of sense to me, though I do believe the developers and writers could have explained it even better. Their flaw is that they stand out like beacons to anyone with supernatural perception. Any use of a supernatural power on a sorcerer for the purpose of perception enjoys a -2 difficulty. Additionally, attempts to penetrate a sorcerer's supernatural concealment using an opposed power are considered to operate one level higher than normal, so a character with Auspex 2 trying to penetrate a sorcerer's obfuscate has an effective Auspex of 3. Now, according to the core book, this flaw is attributed to age. The fact that this sorcery is super old and such prolonged practice from generation to generation leaves marks on its practitioners. Okay, my problem here is, at the time of the Bali Wars, Tzimisce the Eldest was already learning Koldunism from Kupala, and the Koldun don't have such a flaw due to prolonged exposure. I think a better justification for the Ashipu's flaw is the covenant itself. The vampire before you effectively has a pact, a bond with one or multiple powerful spirits, deities, archetypes, egregores, or whatever you want to call them. They emulate a god and seek to become one themselves, the master of heaven and earth. How is that not going to register in the aura? Of course it's going to. A covenant of this nature cannot be concealed, usually, because even when the sorcerer leaves their talismans and cylinder seals back at their haven, the covenant is still running in the background, if we can use that term. It's still ongoing. It's an extended, ongoing process. It doesn't take breaks. It either works or it doesn't. There is no in-between. To conclude, this practice borrows from a plethora of historical, religious, and ritual practices, and this is why the Assamite Ashipu are priests, exorcists, warriors, shamans, paladins, infernalists, all of these things and in any combination. Some might begin their practice by engaging with Mesopotamian beliefs, others by exploring Neoplatonism, and others still through current forms of shamanism. As long as a covenant can be made, the manifestations of that bond can take very diverse forms. Given that covenants can be made with both benevolent and malevolent spirits, the magi aren't necessarily bound by morality in their practices, though they are still bound and constrained by clan culture and clan morality. They are the children of Hakim, the judge, and should they disobey his laws and consort with unclean things, they will be judged. One final thing to mention, which I find absolutely fascinating and endlessly frightening, is Ur-Shulgi's reform. After his awakening in the late 1990s, he breaks the Tremere blood curse with ease, this mage who single-handedly turned the tide of the Bali Wars, and he is now the shepherd, the eldest of the clan, in Hakim's absence. What Ur-Shulgi wants is to return the clan to a fundamental ideology centered around Hakim and the Path of Blood, purging the Assamites of weakness, get this, by forbidding the worship of any other gods and religions. One cannot help but notice this effectively means the dissolution of the sorcerer caste, leaving him the only Ashipu left and the most powerful. It's no wonder that some sorcerers and viziers didn't simply bow their heads when faced with such a reform, and instead fled to the Camarilla under the guidance of Al-Ashrat, one of Ur-Shulgi's children. And of course, the remaining loyalists are encouraged to hunt down schismatic traitors, which is, again, a very interesting situation and a very interesting consequence of Ur-Shulgi's reform. Thank you for bearing with me as I tried to explain this elusive practice, Dur-An-Ki, as thoroughly as I could in a way that is according to the lore books and also makes sense with some real-life practices and general principles of magic. It's clear to me that the writers were inspired by a variety of different practices when they wrote this, which can be very confusing very quickly and turns everything into a stew of sorts, but ultimately it opens up playability, since the Assamite mage can make use of elements from so many interesting cultures. I really hope this explanation was satisfactory and helpful. Everything comes down to covenants, it seems. Take care, have fun, and don't forget to play.